To begin part 2 of the presentation on writing research papers, now that we've discussed what citing means and why we do it, I want to take a look at what happens when writers fail to correctly cite their sources of information. So this time we'll be starting with the bad news. Plagiarism comes from the Latin word plagiari, which means to kidnap or steal away. Today it means to take and then pass off information as if it were your own. In the world of research, that's a little bit like forgery or identity theft. When you commit plagiarism, you are representing something that belongs to someone else as your own. Not every teacher views plagiarism as coming in two forms, but I wanted to kind of give some idea of the varieties of plagiarism that are out there. So one way to start with this is to talk about the idea of intentional plagiarism versus unintentional plagiarism. But I first want to make clear that regardless of whether a writer intends to do it or accidentally commits plagiarism, it's still the same offense and it's still the same illegitimacy that you're putting into your own paper. The idea of intentional plagiarism is pretty obvious. If you buy a paper, if you take something that belongs to someone else, if you copy an entire paper, and even in shorter cases, the amount of plagiarism doesn't really make a whole lot of difference in whether or not it's plagiarism. Even one sentence in a paper that's taken from someone else without being correctly noted qualifies as plagiarism. In the other category of unintentional plagiarism, this gets a little trickier. Sometimes writers will say that they forgot to put correct punctuation or simply forgot to do something, and many times that's probably true. But this is where it becomes very, very important to read your paper carefully, to edit carefully, to proofread carefully, to ensure that every time you have used someone else's words or someone else's idea, you've correctly given them credit. For the next part of this presentation, I'm going to use this quotation as kind of a reference point in discussing how writers could very easily, either intentionally or unintentionally, commit plagiarism if they were to try to incorporate this quotation or idea. Read it while we're here, but there's no need to memorize it. When I refer back to it, if you need it, I'll put the quotation back on the screen. But you may want to pause here for a minute and think about the question that you see in front of you. How would you as a writer include this type of quotation in your paper if you wanted to do so? Next, we'll look at some ways that you would not want to use this quotation in your paper, some things you'd want to avoid. As you'll see in this example, just for lack of two little quotation marks, we have an incidence of plagiarism. If I were to read this sentence as it's presented there at the top of this slide in someone's paper, I would be assuming that the writer of the paper came up with this particular wording and this particular expression of the idea on his own or on her own. When in fact, as we saw in the previous slide, this is exactly what the writers McCall and Dutcher said. So simply by misrepresenting the wording of an idea, a writer can very easily and even unintentionally commit plagiarism. On this particular slide, the top quotation is the original, which we saw a moment ago. The bottom is what might be represented in a research paper that was using this as one of its sources. Take a moment here to think about why the second quotation is plagiarizing the first. You might even want to pause the recording here if you need a few seconds to look at it and think about it carefully. Yes, there are some differences between the two sentences, but as you can see, most of the second statement came from the first. There's very little difference except in the matter of a few minor words, such as changing each to a and changing piece to fragment. The wording of the second is so close to the first that this should really be put into quotation marks, or the parts that are quoted directly should certainly be put into quotation marks to avoid plagiarism. This writer hasn't done that. Before we wrap up this part of the conversation about plagiarism, I wanted to share with you a true story, an incident that came up several years ago involving a very public and publicized bit of plagiarism. We'll get back to that original quotation in a moment, and before we're finished here, I hope you'll have some ideas of how you can include the other quotation in your paper. This is not just a picky exercise in gotcha designed by English teachers. I want you to read the passage above that describes the flight of fighter planes during World War II. And then I'd also like you to read this quotation that describes the flight of fighter planes during World War II. If you like the first one, you'll probably like this one too. And as you'll see, if you simply rewind a moment and look at the earlier one, this quotation is taken not quite verbatim, but very closely from the original. And I've put the plagiarized words in italics here just so you can see the amount of overlap between the original, which was written several years before the quotation here from Stephen Ambrose's book. Looking at this actual example from two pieces of published writing about World War II, I'd like to pause and think about a few questions involving plagiarism. You've got the questions here on your screen. I'd like you to take a moment, even if it involves pausing this presentation, to think about these questions and think about your own answers to these questions. I'm including this slide basically so you'll know that the previous example is not my own ironic example of plagiarism. I did get this example from hearing it in the news when it came about, but also found it in an online source. I wanted to give credit where it was due. In case you're curious, Stephen Ambrose didn't go to jail for this offense. He wasn't even fined, and in fact the original author even said he was kind of flattered to be quoted so directly by such a noted author and historian as Stephen Ambrose. But it did make irreparable harm to Stephen Ambrose's reputation. And in fact, as people began reading other writings he had done more closely, they found that often he had been a little loose in his citing of original sources. So as we wrap up this part of the presentation and kind of conclude our discussion of plagiarism, at least for now, I want to return to the original question we had at the beginning. How can we take this really nice, well-worded quotation and bring it into our own paper without committing plagiarism? This is the last slide of part 2 of the presentation, so this is a good time to pause and take a look here and think about how you yourself would bring this information into your paper. Part 3 of the presentation, which comes up next, will give you some ideas about how you could do so in a legitimate way that will keep you safely away from plagiarism.